Welcome to another video by Pharaoh's Technology. Today we're going to take a deep dive into what makes aggregate queries. So let's get started. I've taken a transaction table and I've linked it to just a dates table that will take regular order date and attach it to various different items that I can use in my queries, such as period or year or month, such as those type of things. Period is going to give me a view of the data that is by month, 2011 and 07. So I can see the year and month. So it's going to divide it essentially by month and year so that I can take a look at the data and do some decent aggregations on the line item totals that were in each of the orders for that period of time. Now, what an aggregation is a manipulation of data, either summing it, counting it, averaging it, doing a number of functions. And it is an automatic function within Access to do that with this thing called the totals button up here. Now, sometimes they're referred to just as totals queries because simply it is invoked by using a button that says totals under it. When you invoke that button, it also puts a line down here that says total. So a lot of times programmers will just get in the habit of calling them, oh, they're just totals queries. The term aggregate is a little bit long and sometimes a little bit obscure in the modern nomenclature, but it invokes this line that allows me to group data by certain attributes and to then total or sum or such things to another set of data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group by period. In other words, I want my data grouped by month. So you saw 2011-07 was at the top of the list there. I'm going to group the data, and this line total is going to be where I do some aggregations, okay? So now, this is my list of aggregations that you see on the screen. You know, I can sum it, I can average it, I can take the minimum value, the maximum value, I can take and count it. I could even compute a standard deviation or a variance amount. I can find the first record or the last record, depending how it's sorted. And then there's expression and where that I'll talk about toward the end of the video. So what happens when I sum the data? I run it, and what you'll see up here is that it'll take 2011-07 as a grouping and then take all of the records within that 2011-07 grouping and total them all together. So that is my sum. Now, it treats the data as separate values. In other words, 2011-07, it will group it first, and then it will do the math to total the revenue or the line totals in this case. It'll total all that. Now, one thing that you'll notice real quickly is I don't want to ever hand this to a user with a cryptic title such as sum of line total. You know, that just doesn't work. So let's take care of that one really quick. And here we'll just call this revenue. So I'll call it revenue total. And now when I run it, it'll say revenue total. It automatically assumes, of course, that on the left, it's going to be a total of 2011-07. So a total of July in 2011. So I have a total there. I have a good looking column. What else can I do? So if I go over here, I'm not always going to be summing. Sometimes I need to also count. And I can also do it multiple times. I can put line total in there again. And what happens if I take then and count now the number of records? Well, let's not count line total. Let's count the number of transaction IDs. The transaction IDs will give me a unique, because it's the key field in this dim table up here. It's the key field up here. If I count the transaction ID, I know it's unique. I know it's going to give me a count of the number that are in that period. So let's take a look at that. So now I not only have a revenue total, but I also have a count of the number of transactions. And again, I've got this funky looking title, and I can go take care of that also just by saying transactions. Now, what do I want to do now? Well, I can go here and I can look at my list and I say, well, wait a minute, that's not going to tell me. Well, maybe it will. Let's go look at average here. Let's take the average of line total again. So now I have a line total, and now I'm going to average. Now, if I sum it and count it, I could put a formula over here, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and it's an average sale of $3,000. My average sale this month was $4,000. Okay, and on it goes. Now, I also want to take average transaction. Okay, so I've got average transaction. But let's say instead of doing the average function, because maybe I'm a little nervous that that's not going to give me a real accurate number, I could go ahead and say average sale. I'm going to just give it a little bit different name, even though it means the same thing. Average sale, and I'm going to take the line total. I'm going to take revenue total over here, which is already summed. And I'm going to divide it by transactions. And I'll tab out there. Now, I'll go ahead and group. Actually, this is what they call an expression. So when you want to put a formula up here of your own making, like you want to calculate the percentage of margin or sales profit or various different things, if you put a formula in here, you can then, you label that as an expression, and then you run it. And if I open this, notice that I need to make it a currency to make it look better. So let's go ahead and open that properties window and make this a currency. And I'll close that and open that up. And notice that I'm getting the same dollar amount across here, proving that the average function in my totals line really does give me an average of the revenue grouping along with the period grouping divided by the number of transactions within that grouping as well. So this divided by that is, in fact, by formula, the same as the average function. Now, notice the average function only took it out 4 digits, and this has an insane number of digits behind it. So let's look at some of the other options, okay? So some of the other options are min and max. In other words, what it'll do is it'll look within that grouping of period, and it'll look at the minimum transaction, for example. So let's look at the min transaction. Let's get rid of this word average transactions here and just let it float with what changes I make. So the minimum order is $13. I could also pull line total in here afterwards, and let's say, well, what if that's the min, what is the maximum transaction that I have in there? And the maximum transaction is $21,000. So you see, as I continue to build and use the different functions here, I can actually query out quite a bit of information within the various functions. Standard deviation is interesting. If you need to know where your standard deviation figures are, I can get the first and last. Now, what about this where clause? Okay, let's say that, I've got a period over here, and I'm summing by period and all that stuff. Let's say that I need to filter the period to simply a period that is a single period. Well, I don't want to group it by that again. I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to go by 2011-07. So I only want to see one period, okay? Okay, when I run this, I get an error if I haven't already put it in as a grouping or a summing or some other aggregate function. It complains because I've got period hanging out there and it doesn't really know what to do with it. In other words, I have to have it in the aggregate portion of the query before it can filter with it. Now, when you're doing a select query, this is totally normal. It's totally normal just to have nothing up here and have just a filter there. It knows what to do when you're doing a select query. The problem is with this totals line here, it doesn't know what to do. You have to tell it that it needs to put it in the where clause. It's a nuance with the totals query that forces you to put it in the where clause. And that's the only reason where exists down here, is so that you can make sure to tell it if you've got a filter that you're filtering by that you're not using anywhere else in the query, but you need that filter sitting off of there. And generally, you don't even show it in the query. Notice the check is unchecked. You need to tell it to put it in the where clause so that it knows how to actually run that. And here you've got your average again, your mean. This has been a deep dive into how to deal with an aggregate query. And I know I've rambled on a little bit here, but aggregate queries are incredibly useful and they're incredibly powerful. And if you use them well, you can tweeze a lot of data out there and provide a lot of analysis for your boss or your customers, whoever you're servicing the data to. So hope you've enjoyed the video. Please hit that like button if you think it's valuable, and hope to see you again in another video there. Thanks.